is to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. Significantly, as courts and secularists began to remove public religious expressions, they simultaneously clamored separation of church and state, claiming this is what the founders wanted. This was their great intent. So often have they repeated the separation phrase when talking about the First Amendment that many citizens today now believe that the phrase is actually part of the First Amendment, thus demonstrating the truth of a statement attributed to Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology. There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. The court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. For nearly 2 centuries prior to that case, the word church in the phrase separation of church and state was defined to mean a federally established national denomination, such as was represented by the Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. However, in 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was. Jefferson very wisely attached separation of church and state to what we call the Free Exercise Clause.
Wow.
Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, here's a really fun thing that we don't hear much about. We're told today that this is one of the great intents of the Founding Fathers, is separation of church and state. Well, first off, Thomas Jefferson was not a framer of the First Amendment. He was not even in America when the First Amendment was framed. He was overseas in Europe. He had no part in framing it. As a matter of fact, a biography that was written by Joseph Priestley about Thomas Jefferson tried to link Jefferson to the First Amendment of the Constitution. And Jefferson wrote back his friend and said, no, you got to take me out of that section. I had nothing to do with the Constitution. I had nothing to do with the Bill of Rights. I was not in America when it was done. I was not a participant. I had one letter sent to me about what was going to be in it, and that's all. I never even saw it till I got back to America. So we've made a guy who had no role in the First Amendment to be the chief spokesman on it. Now, what we've got is we have 90 Founding Fathers who did frame the First Amendment. All of their debates, from start to finish, are in the records of Congress from June the 19th or 20th of 1789 to about September the 24th and 25th of 1789. So you have these guys for several months, 90 guys going after the language of the First Amendment. Here's what we'll permit, here's what we won't permit. All the records of Congress are there. Not one single one of those 90 Founding Fathers ever even mentioned the phrase separation of church and state when they're framing the First Amendment. They didn't even talk about it. Now, it seemed like if that was their intent for the First Amendment, somebody would have said something about it.
Right.
Phrase is not mentioned one time. It's mentioned in a letter that comes later by Thomas Jefferson.
That had nothing to do with the framing of it.
All that letter had to do was to reassure them the government's not going to interfere with their religious expression. And so he uses a metaphor that is well known to those people. Baptists have had it, Christians have had it. Any Reformation-minded person understands separation of church and state means keep the institutions apart. Don't let the government stop our religious expressions, keep it apart. and now we've turned it completely on its head. You see, what's happened today is if we really believed separation of church and state, then we wouldn't allow the state to have zoning or building codes that affect the church. We wouldn't allow the state to have any kind of influence over health codes in the church or employment codes of the church or tax codes of the church. We'd say separation church and state, state, you can't touch the church at all if we really believe separation church and state. But what's happened is separation church and state means, oh, you religious people can't get involved in the public arena. Reversal from what it's supposed to be. The Constitution mandates in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that written records be kept of what goes on in Congress. The founders required this because they wanted government open, accessible, and accountable to the people. Within the congressional records, you or I at any time can read what our elected officials are doing and saying, or not doing and not saying, and then hold them accountable. Every debate and every vote which has taken place in Congress from 1774 to the present is recorded in these public records. And it is because of these records that we know exactly what happened when Congress moved into this building. According to the records for late November of 1800, Congress spent the first few weeks organizing the rooms, the committees, their locations, etc. And then, in the first week of December 1800, Congress made an interesting decision. What was that decision? Congress decided that the Capitol building would also serve as a church building. The U.S. Capitol, this building, became a church. The use of this building as a church building is confirmed not only by the records of Congress, but also by the diaries of those who served in Congress at the time. For example, when John Quincy Adams was a U.S. Senator in 1803, he recorded in his diary for October the 30th, attended public service at the Capitol, where Mr. Rattoon, an Episcopalian clergyman from Baltimore, preached a sermon. The week before, he had written, religious service is usually performed on Sundays at the Treasury office and at the Capitol. I went both forenoon and afternoon to the Treasury. Very few realize that this building, as well as other government buildings, served as church buildings, but indeed such was the case.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Dave, what I think you have just done is given me information about what I thought I knew about the term separation of church and state, and spun the term separation of church and state literally 180 degrees from the original intent of its framers.
Or it was state, you stay out of our affairs. Get out of our face.
Let me show you how corrupt the interpretation has become. Because the First Amendment to the Constitution is very simple. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, if we don't understand that, we go to the records of Congress. That means Congress cannot establish a federal denomination. They can't make us all Baptists, Presbyterians, or anything else. And Congress can't do anything to impede religious expression. That was their goal. You stay out of regulating people's religious expressions, and you don't set up a federal church. Now, that's what it meant. And so from the time that the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, all the way until 1947, that's what the First Amendment meant. But in 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we need to change this a little bit. They said Jefferson used separation of church and state to protect the free exercise of religion. We think he applied it to the wrong clause. Instead of keeping the government out, we need to apply separation of church and state to government expressions. And so what we need to do now is stop religious activities in public. So they came up with what's called the Establishment Test in 1947. Then we get to a number of cases coming to the court that deal with religious expression. And in those cases at the court said, you know, we've got so many cases, we better erect a new standard so you understand what's constitutional religion. And the case 1971 called Lemon versus Kurtzman, they came out with a three-pronged test. It's called the Lemon test because it came out of the case Lemon versus Kurtzman. It says if you want a religious activity to be constitutional, here's what you have to do. They said the only way that a public religious expression is going to be constitutional is if the primary purpose of that public religious expression is secular. Now, wait a minute. That's completely oxymoronic. There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of prayer is secular. There's no way you can prove the primary purpose of the display of the nativity scene is secular. There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of saying under God in the pledge is secular. You can't do it. And so now we lose every case on religious expression because of the lemon test, which says unless religion has a secular primary purpose, you can't do it. Well, that was 1971. So then we move along to 1985, and in the case of 1985, the court came up with a new test for the First Amendment. It's called the endorsement test. And they said, you know, if it looks like the government is even friendly to religion, that's unconstitutional. And so now they have to appear to be hostile. So anytime religion pops up, they go, oh no, we can't do that. And that's why you can't have a student individually say something religious at a graduation. Wow. That's why you can't have a city councilman say something religious to open a city council, because that might look like government's being friendly to religion. That's the endorsement test. And the final and the most absurd test was given in 1992, and the Supreme Court calls it the outsider test. And the outsider test says, you know, if you're part of a religious minority, like if you're an atheist, only 6% of America doesn't believe in God, so if you're in that religious minority and you see somebody else doing a religious activity in the majority that makes you feel like an outsider, we'll make them all stop so that you won't feel like an outsider. So as you look across the cases, we had several dozen cases on the Ten Commandments in America, Ten Commandments displays. The people who sued in those cases, you'll find the same phrase in every one of them. They said, you know, I was walking down the sidewalk and I looked over at the Capitol and I saw that monument of the Ten Commandments, and when I saw that, I felt like an outsider in my own nation. And so the court stepped in and say, all right, take out the Ten Commandments. You can't feel it. Well, how about the 94% who don't feel like outsiders? Right. And by the way, if the 94% say, I feel like an outsider when it's gone, they say, oh, you're in the majority, you don't count. This only works if you're in a religious minority. So now separation church and state means that it has to be secular, government can't appear to be friendly toward religion, and if religious expression of somebody individually makes you feel uncomfortable, we'll make them all stop. That's completely reversed from the original separation that meant government, don't stop a religious expression. It's not your business to tell us what religious expressions are supposed to occur. What a reversal of separation church and state just in the last 50 years.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.